This interview is an original work of fiction and intended solely for entertainment purposes. The responses attributed to the magicians Jannes and Jambres are entirely imagined, and any resemblance to real events or persons, living or deceased, is purely coincidental. The content presented here is not meant to convey actual historical facts or suggest supernatural communication with the dead.
Welcome to the Afterwords. Today we have a rare opportunity, speaking with Jannes and Jambres, the infamous magicians from Pharaoh's court who opposed Moses during the Exodus. These two figures, though only briefly mentioned in the Bible and later Jewish and Christian traditions, left a lasting mark on history as symbols of resistance to divine power. But before we begin with our questions, let's allow Jannes and Jambres to introduce themselves.
I am Jannes, one of the magicians from Pharaoh's court, trained in the ancient mysteries of Egypt, in the knowledge of the gods and the manipulation of the unseen forces of nature. For years, I stood at Pharaoh's right hand, confident in our abilities to maintain the balance of power in Egypt. I've been portrayed as a villain in the tale of Exodus, but there's much more to my story than just opposition to Moses.
And I am Jambres, brother in the arts to Jannes, and a fellow advisor to Pharaoh. My life was dedicated to the mastery of enchantments, not just for personal gain, but to uphold Egypt's divine order. We were not merely tricksters. We were guardians of the old ways. Moses challenged us, and in that moment we were forced to face truths we hadn't anticipated. But remember, every story has more than one side.
Many of us have read the biblical account where you both confronted Moses. But what were your actual thoughts when you saw Aaron's staff turn into a serpent for the first time?
At first, we were unimpressed. Egypt was a land of wonders, and we were well versed in the arts of magic and illusion. We had seen miracles before, both natural and contrived. When Aaron's staff became a serpent, it was merely another trick in a long line of theatrics that Pharaoh had witnessed. We believed our own powers could match it, and for a moment, they did.
But what the scriptures don't dwell on is the moment after our serpents were consumed by Aaron's. That was the first inkling that what we were up against wasn't ordinary. The weight of what we were facing didn't fully register then, but we could feel something shift. For us, it was a battle of egos, but for Moses and Aaron, it was a divine confrontation.
Your magic seemed to work in the beginning. You turned staffs into snakes and you replicated some of the plagues. When did you realize you were outmatched?
It wasn't until the third plague, the plague of gnats, that we realized our powers were limited. We had performed feats that astonished even Pharaoh, but when the gnats covered every inch of Egypt, we could not replicate it. Our enchantments failed. At that point we turned to Pharaoh and admitted, "This is the finger of God." But he, in his pride, refused to listen.
There's an important detail that often gets overlooked. Magic, as we practiced it, was a manipulation of natural forces, a blend of knowledge, illusion, and spiritual alignment. But what Moses wielded was not magic as we knew it. It was a command over nature, an act of creation and destruction that transcended anything human hands could conjure. We weren't simply outmatched in skill. We were dealing with a power that redefined the very rules of existence.
Why didn't you stop after admitting to Pharaoh that this is the finger of God? Why continue opposing Moses?
Pride. When you've spent your life cultivating power, controlling perception, and bending reality to your will, admitting defeat is harder than facing annihilation. We had everything to lose, our positions, our reputations, our legacy. To stop would have been an admission that everything we had built our lives on was a lie. So we pressed on, knowing we were no longer fighting Moses, but our own hubris.
There's also the matter of Pharaoh. He wasn't just our ruler, he was a god in the eyes of Egypt. To turn our backs on him would have been treason. We were trapped in a system of power and belief that gave us no room to act otherwise. And so we continued, even as we knew the outcome was already sealed.
Did you ever feel regret for the suffering that followed, especially when the plagues intensified?
Regret? Perhaps in the smallest of moments, when we saw the devastation unfold. But it's important to understand the mindset we had. We were priests of a system that believed suffering was part of the natural order. Egypt was built on the backs of the suffering. To us, this was just another cycle of destruction and rebirth, a balancing of power. The gods had their ways, and we were merely instruments.
But regret did creep in when the plagues reached a point where our own families, our own people, began to suffer. We realized too late that the powers we invoked were not to be trifled with, and that Pharaoh's stubbornness would cost us everything. Yet we still felt bound to him, by duty, fear, and the unshakable belief that somehow we could turn the tide.
Some traditions claim that you were sons of Balaam, a figure later associated with sorcery and divination. Is that true?
It's interesting you bring that up. The link to Balaam was one that grew over time. We weren't his sons by blood, but in spirit. Balaam, like us, was a man who thought he could twist divine power for personal gain, that he could use spiritual forces as tools rather than serve them. In that sense, we are indeed his spiritual descendants.
Balaam was revered in some circles, feared in others, but ultimately, like us, he faced the consequences of overestimating his control over divine forces. The parallels between his story and ours are striking, but we didn't know of him as our contemporary. Those connections were made later by the storytellers.
The Bible says Aaron's serpent swallowed yours. How did that moment impact you?
That was the first time we felt a true loss of control. It was one thing to replicate the miracle, but for Aaron's serpent to consume ours was a direct message. The symbolism wasn't lost on us. It was an unmistakable signal of the overwhelming force we were up against, and yet, as magicians and advisors to Pharaoh, we couldn't afford to let fear show. Publicly, we downplayed it. Privately, it haunted us.
There's an irony in that act. We believed we could outwit divine will, manipulate nature with our rituals and spells. But that moment, when Aaron's staff devoured ours, showed us that nature, and by extension, divine power, could consume us just as easily. It foreshadowed what was to come, but we were too blind to accept it then.
Many people see you as villains in the Exodus story. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Villains. Perhaps from one perspective, yes. We stood against Moses, and therefore against the will of God. But history is written by the victors, isn't it? In our time, we were guardians of Egypt, defenders of tradition, and protectors of Pharaoh's legacy. What you see as villainy was, to us, a necessary fight to preserve the world as we knew it.
If we are to be judged, it should be by our motives. We acted out of loyalty, to our gods, to our people, to the world order we had known our whole lives. In doing so, we may have become instruments of suffering, but the line between villain and hero is often one of perspective. Would Moses have been seen as a hero in Egypt? Certainly not.
What would you say to those who see magic as inherently evil, especially in light of your story?
Magic itself is not inherently evil. Magic is the manipulation of unseen forces, the bending of nature's rules to achieve a desired result. The intent behind the act defines its morality. When we practiced magic in Egypt, it was part of our religious and social fabric. It was a tool of the priesthood, used to interpret the will of the gods and keep balance in society.
The evil wasn't in the magic itself, but in how we used it. We were blinded by our own ambitions, by our desire to maintain power at all costs. The danger with magic, or any power really, is that it can lead you to believe you are above consequence. That's where we faltered, and where many who follow the path of power often fail.
In the end, do you think Moses was right? Were you wrong?
In hindsight, yes. Moses represented a divine plan that was far greater than we could comprehend. His mission wasn't just about freeing slaves. It was about reshaping the world's understanding of divine power, justice, and freedom. We fought for the wrong side, and history bears witness to that.
But it's not as simple as right and wrong. We lived in a world of gods, rituals, and empires. Our actions were dictated by forces much larger than ourselves. Moses was right, but we didn't have the clarity of vision to see it then. Only in the aftermath did we understand the true scope of what we were up against.
Did you ever consider abandoning Pharaoh's court when you saw the power of God through Moses? Or were you too tied to your positions of power?
We considered it. But the pull of power is intoxicating. You see, leaving Pharaoh's court wasn't just about walking away from a job. It meant leaving behind a world where we held sway, where we were respected and feared. Egypt was the center of the world, and we were at its core. To leave was unthinkable. In many ways, we were prisoners of our own influence.
There's also the reality of what would have happened had we left. Pharaoh didn't take kindly to betrayal. Even if we had seen the truth of Moses' mission earlier, abandoning our posts would have been seen as treason. And treason in Pharaoh's Egypt was met with swift, brutal punishment. We stayed, not just out of loyalty, but out of fear.
Some scholars suggest that magicians like you were also healers in ancient Egypt. Did you use your magic for healing as well?
Yes, healing was a significant part of our craft. Magic wasn't just about power and illusion. It was about understanding the natural world, herbs, minerals, and the elements. We used spells and rituals to cure ailments, treat wounds, and calm the suffering. For many in Egypt, we were the closest thing to physicians.
There's irony here, of course. We, who once used magic to heal, became agents of destruction in the plagues. The very hands that healed the sick could not save Egypt from the wrath of God. That was a bitter realization for us.
What was it like witnessing the final plague, the death of the firstborn? How did that affect you personally?
That was the moment when everything changed. The death of the firstborn was not just a plague. It was a death sentence for Egypt's future. For the first time, we saw Pharaoh truly shaken. We too lost family members that night. This plague didn't discriminate. It cut across every level of society, from the lowliest servant to the royal palace.
The final plague wasn't just a loss of life. It was the death of Egypt's spirit. Up until then, we had managed to retain some semblance of control, but when the cries of mourning filled the air, we knew that the gods had abandoned us. No amount of magic could reverse what had happened. It was the end of an era, and we were powerless to stop it.
Did you ever have personal interactions with Moses or Aaron, beyond what's recorded? What were those moments like?
We had a few private moments where we crossed paths with Moses. He was a quiet, focused man, stern but not without compassion. I remember one moment before the plagues began, where our eyes met across Pharaoh's court. In that brief glance, I could see that he knew we were doomed, even if we didn't. It wasn't arrogance, it was more like sadness. I think Moses pitied us.
Aaron, on the other hand, was more vocal. He was Moses' mouthpiece in many ways, and his faith in their mission was unshakable. While Moses was a reluctant leader, Aaron fully embraced his role. I remember him telling us that it wasn't too late to change sides, but we ignored him. Looking back, it feels like a missed opportunity to escape the chaos that followed.
Did the other magicians or priests in Pharaoh's court feel the same way you did? Or were you too unique in your struggle against Moses?
There were others in the court who shared our skepticism, but few had the courage to challenge Pharaoh. Many of the magicians saw Moses as a threat to the natural order, but they were content to stay in the background, letting us take the lead. Some of them even began to question whether our powers were truly divine or mere illusions.
I think what made us unique was our prominence. We were Pharaoh's trusted advisors, and when the plagues began, all eyes were on us. The others looked to us for answers, and when we couldn't provide them, we became the faces of failure. That's a weight we carried through the entire ordeal.
Did you ever believe in the Egyptian gods? Or were you simply using religion as a tool for power?
That's a question we asked ourselves many times. Growing up, we were steeped in the religious traditions of Egypt, and we believed in the gods as real entities that shaped the world. But as we became more skilled in magic, there was a shift. We started to see the gods less as beings to be worshipped, and more as forces to be controlled. In that sense, religion became a tool, a way to manipulate power.
By the time Moses arrived, we had lost most of our reverence for the gods. It wasn't that we didn't believe in them, but we no longer feared them. That was our mistake. We had placed ourselves above the divine order, thinking we could control it. Moses' arrival shattered that illusion.
The Bible suggests you were both present at the Red Sea when the waters parted. If so, what was that experience like?
We were indeed there. though not as leaders. After the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh's army pursued the Israelites, and we, along with other members of Pharaoh's court, followed. We didn't truly believe they would make it out of Egypt alive. But when the waters of the Red Sea parted, it was unlike anything we had ever seen. It wasn't magic. It was raw, divine power.
I remember the feeling of awe as the sea walls rose on either side. It was terrifying, but also beautiful. At that moment, all doubt was gone. We knew that we had been wrong to challenge Moses, but by then, it was too late. Watching the sea close over Pharaoh's army was the final confirmation that Egypt's time had ended.
Do you think magic, as you practiced it, has a place in the world today?
Magic in its purest form is a search for understanding, a way to bridge the gap between what is seen and unseen. In that sense, magic still has a place, though it would take on different forms today. In the modern world, science has taken the role magic once held, seeking to explain the mysteries of existence.
But there's still a longing for something beyond science, something spiritual, something mystical. People today might call it intuition or manifestation, but the desire to connect with unseen forces hasn't disappeared. Magic, as we practiced it, may no longer fit, but the human need for wonder and mystery endures.
In the Christian tradition, Paul uses you as examples of men who resist the truth. What do you think of this comparison?
Paul wasn't wrong to use us as examples of resistance to divine truth. In many ways, we symbolize the human tendency to reject what we can't control. We resisted Moses not because we didn't believe, but because we didn't want to accept a reality where we weren't in charge.
But what Paul doesn't mention is the fear that drove us. It's easy to label us as villains, but the truth is more complicated. We were scared of losing our place, our power, and our identity. Resistance wasn't just about pride. It was about survival.
What would you say to someone today who is struggling with the idea of faith versus logic?
Faith and logic don't have to be at odds. In our time, we relied on logic and knowledge to understand the world, but we also recognized the limits of what we could comprehend. Faith fills those gaps. It isn't about abandoning reason, but about accepting that there are things beyond human understanding.
I would say that faith is about humility. It's the recognition that no matter how much we know, there is always more beyond the horizon. In our downfall, we learned the hard way that trying to control everything through logic, magic, or power only leads to destruction.
If you could go back and change one thing about your story, what would it be?
If I could change one thing, it would be the moment we first dismissed Moses as a mere magician. We were so blinded by our own abilities that we couldn't see the truth right in front of us. If we had recognized the divine nature of Moses' mission earlier, perhaps things would have been different.
I agree. I would have listened, not just to Moses, but to the voice inside me that warned we were heading down a dangerous path. Sometimes, the greatest wisdom is in knowing when to step back and admit you don't have all the answers.
How did the culture of Egypt shape your worldview? And did it prevent you from seeing Moses' message for what it was?
Egypt was the pinnacle of civilization at the time. We were taught from birth that we were part of the greatest empire on earth, that Pharaoh was a living god, and that our way of life was ordained by the divine. This mindset made it nearly impossible to accept that a slave, an outcast like Moses, could wield true divine power. To us, Egypt's gods were the ultimate forces of the universe, and Pharaoh was their chosen representative. Moses' message directly challenged everything we believed, not just about religion, but about the natural order of the world itself.
Egypt's culture was deeply hierarchical. Everything had its place, and we were at the top of that structure. To admit that Moses was right would have meant admitting that the foundation of our society was flawed. The truth is, we couldn't see Moses' message for what it was, because it threatened the very core of our identity, not just as individuals, but as Egyptians.
After witnessing so much destruction, do you think Egypt deserved what happened? Was there any justice in the plagues?
At the time it felt like senseless destruction, but now, with the benefit of hindsight, I see it differently. Egypt was a powerful empire, and that power was built on the backs of the enslaved. We benefited from a system that was deeply unjust, and we were complicit in its continuation. The plagues, as harsh as they were, forced a reckoning. They were a form of divine justice, though we were too blinded by our own interests to recognize it at the time.
Deserve is a difficult word. Egypt, like any empire, was a mix of light and shadow. The common people suffered alongside the slaves, and not everyone in Pharaoh's court was as ruthless as history remembers. But as Jambres said, we were part of a system that was deeply corrupt. The plagues revealed the cracks in our empire's foundation, and while the suffering was immense, perhaps it was the only way for real change to happen.
If Moses was sitting here today, what would you say to him?
I would tell him that he was right. Not just about God, but about everything. He saw beyond the trappings of power, beyond the illusions that we wrapped ourselves in. While we were focused on maintaining the status quo, he was focused on something far greater: freedom, justice, and the divine plan.
I would ask him if he ever saw us as anything more than adversaries. We were on opposite sides of history, but I wonder if he ever felt pity for us, knowing that we were bound by the same system of power that enslaved the Israelites. I'd like to think that Moses, with his wisdom, understood the complexity of our position.
In Jewish tradition, you are sometimes linked to Balaam, another figure who opposed Israel. Do you see parallels between your stories?
Balaam, like us, thought he could manipulate divine power for his own purposes. He saw himself as a master of the supernatural, believing he could bend the will of God to suit his needs. In that sense, yes, there's a strong parallel. We, too, thought we could stand against the divine, that our magic and knowledge made us invincible.
The difference, perhaps, is that Balaam seemed to understand his limits eventually, though too late. We didn't fully grasp ours until the very end, when it was clear that Moses was not just a rival magician, but a prophet carrying out the will of the Almighty. Balaam and we were both caught in a struggle against a force far greater than we could ever control.
Do you think there's a lesson in your story for today's world?
Absolutely. Our story is a reminder of the dangers of arrogance, of thinking that human power, knowledge, or skill can ever fully control the forces that govern the universe. Whether it's magic, science, or politics, there's always a limit to what we can understand and control. The key is recognizing that limit before it's too late.
I think the lesson is also about the importance of humility and the ability to listen to voices that challenge your worldview. We were so entrenched in our ways that we couldn't see the truth staring us in the face. In today's world, where people often resist anything that challenges their beliefs or threatens their power, our story serves as a cautionary tale. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is to step back, admit you don't know everything, and be open to change.
We hope this imagined conversation with Jannes and Jambres has provided new insight into the minds of two historical figures often cast as villains. Their story is a reminder of the complexities of human nature, how pride, fear, and the thirst for power can blind us to deeper truths. But it's also a story of redemption and reflection, showing us that even those who oppose the divine can find wisdom in the end. Thank you for joining us on the Afterwords. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more explorations of history's most fascinating figures. We'll see you in the next episode.